Hey everyone, and welcome back to Digital Doc Games, where we explore how games help us grow, connect, and heal. Today we are joined by psychiatrist and professor of health and neuroscience at the University of Cambridge, Paul Fletcher. Paul practiced psychiatry full-time in London before becoming involved in neuroimaging research, where he aims to understand mental illness and mental distress more deeply. He now splits his time between research, clinical work, and teaching, and occasionally video game consulting. How you doing, Paul?
Good, thanks. Nice to meet you.
Oh my gosh, it's so great to have you here, Paul. There's so much for us to talk about. Like I said, you're an expert in many domains. Psychosis is something that you've dedicated a large part of your career. So I'm excited to talk about that. And then really, what it was like consulting on the video game Hellblade and what you and developer Ninja Theory are actually doing now to continue your work together. So we're going to talk about all of that and more because this is Digital Doc Interviews, where we talk to the people using video games to help have a positive impact on the world, people like Paul. If you like what we are doing here, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button, and we will keep putting up content and see you back here every single week. So Paul, I would like to get started. Could you just, for anyone who doesn't know about you, Paul, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background?
Sure. Well, I'm sure there are loads of people who don't know anything about me and are perfectly happy in that ignorance. So I trained originally. I'm from South Wales, which is a country that's attached to England, and I trained in medicine in London and then went straight into specializing in psychiatry. And I worked in clinical psychiatry around North London for several years before I went into research. And over the course of my research, I've largely studied the brain and how brain processes contribute to memory and learning and perception and decision making, with a view to trying to understand the neurobiology of certain forms of mental illness. And the particular form that interests me is psychosis, which is the state where somebody is, strictly speaking, separate from reality. But what we mean by that is that they don't share the reality that those around them have. And so they may hear things or see things that aren't there, so-called hallucinations, and they may and they may believe things that seem very bizarre. So I got into the research of that over the last 20 odd years, and that's what I'm still doing alongside my clinical work.
Right. Yeah, and it's such a fascinating topic. What was it about psychosis that sort of grabbed you and said, hey, this we need to dive more deeply into this?
Well, from a sort of very human point of view, when I was a medical student, I had my attachment to a psychiatric hospital, and on the first day, I sat down in the ward and got talking to a young man about my age, and he'd been really plagued by these voices telling him to do things and by beliefs that he was being persecuted, and it had ended up with him mutilating himself quite badly, really badly injuring himself. And I was just, simultaneously horrified at what he was experiencing. It was particularly strange because he was obviously a bright, engaged, thoughtful man, but he seemed to have a completely different reality from mine. And I think that was my first real glimmer of interest into this, how two people could be experiencing the same environment, the same world, could have such different experiences of reality.
Right. It's so interesting hearing you say that, because I had such a similar experience in medical school. Absolutely, without a doubt, my most fascinating patients and the patients who really just grabbed me the most, I think, were on my psychiatric rotation, and it was the patients with schizophrenia, and the patients with even dementia having various hallucinations. What was so interesting to me about it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts if you feel similarly, but every patient that came in with some sort of hallucination or fixed delusion, it was a common one, right? A patient saying that there's a microchip in his head and that the government's tracking him. Or I had a patient come in who thought the FBI was stalking him and his daughter and all these things. And even though their stories were different, the way you could almost see their mind working was the same. And you could lead them down this path, at least in my experience, where you would try and learn more about the reality, about their reality that they're living. And if you got to them to a point of like almost where, someone who, a healthy person would be like, oh, you're right, that this doesn't really make sense. Maybe this isn't true. If you got them to that point, which wasn't necessarily the goal, but if you got them to that point, they would just reset, and they would, and it would all kind of start back to normal. And it was like they couldn't get past that that mental block. And I always just found that so fascinating.
Yeah, I think that is a very striking aspect of being in that state, because it is a reality. It's not a metaphor. It's not figurative. It's the reality that person experiences. And, it's rather like me trying to persuade you that you're not sitting down in front of a computer now. It's just that experience is too real for you to discard it or to be persuaded out of it.
That's
and
right.
I think that's really important, because I think a lot of people don't get that. It's a reality that their mind has created, and that they are invested in totally, just as you and I are invested in our own realities, even though very much of it is actually quite illusory and biased and mistaken.
That's right. And, it just instantly makes me think of how a video game could be such an interesting way to portray an illness like that. And we'll talk about Hellblade and your work with Ninja Theory, the studio that developed Hellblade. But what an interesting thing to have a situation where the player and the character who suffers from an illness are intrinsically tied. And that question of what is your reality? Actually, the background here is from a game called Before I Forget. And I interviewed the makers of Before I Forget. I also did a review for the game. You can check that out. But it's a game about a woman living with dementia, and she's sort of exploring her home. And it's very similar to Hellblade in the sense that, you're experiencing this woman's illness almost as if it was your own. And it's such a powerful way to experience mental illness or physical illness. So Paul, all of that kind of winds up to lead me, how did a once practicing psychiatrist made, psychosis neuro researcher end up working with a video game studio?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it was just a chance email about 4 or 5 years ago from the Ninja Theory studios, from the production manager on Hellblade, Don Matthews. And it was a very short email. He just said, look, we're making a game in which the central character suffers from hallucinations. I think that was how he put it. And we'd like to get it right. And we wonder if you might be willing to give us a bit of time just to talk to us about it. And I guess it came in a very good, it came to the right person at the right time, because I'm actually have been for a long time quite fascinated by what games can achieve in terms of their ability to draw you in.
Right.
To completely immerse you in a situation, and at the same time to engage your activities. So in the context of the game, you're a participant. I think a lot of entertainment forms can lead you to suspend your disbelief, can draw you in. But
right.
I think, I've always felt like games with their ability to make what happens depend on you is a really interesting phenomenon. Anyhow, so I was the right person to ask, really, or one of the right people to ask. And so I went along to meet them, and I met then Tamim Antoniades, who's the creative director, and the three of us chatted for a while, and I think it became very clear to me just how serious they were. They wanted to learn more about it. They didn't want to just get a sort of official seal of approval. They really wanted to learn, and they wanted me to introduce them to people who had lived experience of psychosis. You know, they wanted that to be part of it. And so, so right, you know, almost from the first time I met them, I knew it was something I wanted to be involved in.
Wow. Wow.
And we took it from there, really.
That's amazing. And, you know, what was it like when Tamima told you the synopsis of the game, right? Because, you know, if I try and summarize Hellblade, right, you know, you have this main character, Senua, who's this 8th century Celtic warrior who is on this journey to lay her deceased love to rest, by journeying, you know, to the dimension of Helheim and confronting the underworld goddess of Hela. And once she defeats Hela, then she can lay her love to rest, who was brutally murdered by Vikings.
Yeah,
that is a game that I wouldn't necessarily scream to convey sensitive, you know, mental health portrayal. So what was your reaction when you heard it?
Yeah, well, I'd be lying if I didn't say that didn't play on my mind, because of course, you know, there was a chance that people were going to look at it and just say it was a sort of trope to sell the game. You know, it's a hack and slash game, and you can add a little bit of madness, and everybody's happy. And so I was mindful that from the outside, it could be seen in that way. But
right.
I think there were 2 or 3 things that really made me just want to invest my time in it. One is just talking to Tamim and Dom about what they wanted to achieve, and finding it incredibly resonant with what I thought games could achieve. A second thing was their desire to be totally respectful and to include people who themselves had suffered psychosis. And also it was based upon Tamim's own experience of someone he knew with really? A condition. And so I had a strong sense of trust that they really wanted to do something. And interestingly, at the outset, they'd always seen it as a game that would never be a commercial success.
Yeah.
They said, you know, it might break even. Yeah. They said it might break even, but really we're doing this for love. You know, this is something we feel is an important thing to do.
Right.
And I think that attitude was present throughout. So
yeah,
although, you know, the subject matter, and a lot of people I knew raised their eyebrows when I told them about it. We were fortunate early on to get the blessing of one of the major sort of scientific funding organizations in the UK, the Wellcome Trust. And there's a person working with them called Ian Dodgen, who sort of takes care of the arts and entertainment side, or used to. And he quickly came on board, actually. He said, yeah, the Wellcome would like to sort of sanction this, to be part of it. And I found that very reassuring as well.
And, you know, I kind of led you down a path by setting up, you know, reading that premise of the game to illustrate, you know, how that might have, excuse me, how that might have been a funny experience, you know, hearing the story in the beginning. But the truth is, that's actually my favorite part of the game, that this is a game that handles this topic so seriously and so lovingly, as you said, but it's not about it, right? It's not the selling point. You know, the average person who picks up this game may not even know that she suffers from psychosis, and that's something that's incorporated into the game. And that, I think, actually is what makes it a fantastic game, because it does all these things. It makes you understand the disease. It makes you feel the disease, but it's not hitting you over the head with the disease. And so that was beautifully executed.
Yeah, I'm very glad to hear you say that, because I think that was also one of the central principles, was that this is not a mental illness fighting its way through a game. This is a person fighting their way through a game who happens to have an altered reality. And the other thing that's related to that, Tamim was always very keen that you know, within a game, the lines between fantasy and reality are already blurred, aren't they? Because the player has tacitly agreed to share the game designer's reality for the period of while they're playing.
Right.
And so in some ways, the question of, what is it that she sees is truly real and what is it a product of her mind, it sort of doesn't matter.
That's right.
And also being set in those times, it took us out of this need to be sort of clinical and diagnostic. She wasn't a person with schizophrenia or bipolar affective. That was, she was a Viking, she was a Pict at the time of the Viking invasion, and so it would be anachronistic to worry too much about diagnosis. One thing I did early on was I managed to find somebody had written a PhD thesis in Cambridge University on madness, the culture around madness in Celtic cultures. And so I was able to get this thesis and to really get a strong sense of how somebody like that might be viewed in the 7th or 8th century. And it was a really enlightening thing to read, because they had quite a sophisticated take on the nature of being separate from reality. And a lot of those insights were actually brought into the game.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting time period, where there's no, DSM criteria book for any of these Vikings or anyone to read into. So obviously, witchcraft, comes up, or or cursed by the devil, things like that. But it's interesting having an insight. It's not required, obviously, but having a clinical insight while playing the game, because, at least for me, I picked up on certain things. I mean, the genetic nature of it, her mom suffered from this, and then also the social impacts that I think are totally relative to, today's time, how her father, who in many ways took, you talk about what is real, what is not. Her father sort of was this overarching villain throughout the game, her memories of him and how that came into her world, but really abusing her because of her sickness and telling her that she was unwell. I thought it was just really well done. So Paul, I mean, how did you know how to best help Ninja Theory? What was your role as the clinical advisor? Were you involved with coming up with gameplay mechanics? Because one of the things I love about Hellblade, another thing, is that the psychosis is actually also tied into the gameplay mechanics, which is very cool.
Yeah, so, well, it started with me being fairly textbook-like, just defining how people thought of symptoms like hallucinations, and what the theories were about how they emerged. And I suppose what was really rewarding for me was that Tamim especially got very interested in the neuroscience behind it, and particularly in the area that I work in, which is the idea that all of us in day-to-day life are constructing a reality inside our heads by making predictions about the world and testing those predictions. So it's this sort of quite influential perspective now in cognitive neuroscience, and it can help us to explain lots of visual and auditory illusions. It can help to explain some of our biases. It can help to explain an awful lot of the sort of strangeness of mental experience.
Right.
And Tamim and I spent a lot of time talking about that, and it became clear to him. I mean, I think I'd love to take more credit for it, but I have to place the credit within the game designers area. But it became clear to them that you could actually take these ideas and put them into gameplay, such that whether or not Senua was able to get to a certain point depended upon the perspective she was taking and how she used these predictions to sort of solve the puzzles.
Right.
Similarly, the voices. I think they did an incredible job of replicating the nature of auditory hallucinations. And a lot of that came from talking to people who experienced hallucinations.
Wow.
Finding out that, they would be all around you. There'd be different voices. Sometimes they'd be talking to each other. Sometimes they'd be talking directly. They might be contradicting each other. And all of that was, put into that gameplay as experience.
So when I was interviewing Chella and Claire from Threefold Games, who made Before I Forget, I asked them a question about dementia. And I said, for their game that they created, did they ever think about how the character's dementia might actually be a blessing for her? And I won't get into spoilers here, but there's a couple reasons why that might be true. Why it might be a nice thing, a good thing, a positive thing maybe to forget. Do you ever think about that in terms of psychosis? I was thinking a lot about it, but in Hellblade, but even more generally, the game made me think of, when we talk about the voices that you hear constantly, and the voices are intrusive, right? I mean, that's how you describe them clinically, but it couldn't be more true of a way to describe her experience and the player's experience. But the voices are also vital to her success. And, when there's a door, sometimes the voices will be like, no, don't go in there, don't go in there. But other times the voices are saying, push forward, turn left, there's someone behind you, and there's an enemy coming behind you.
Mm.
What do you think about that? Is psychosis a gift or a curse?
It's a great question. I mean, for me, that's a really, really interesting and useful question, because some of my own research suggests that under the right sort of circumstances, the person prone to psychosis can see patterns that other people can't see. And those are real patterns. They can, almost as though the person can apply their prior instinct or prior knowledge to make sense of the world in ways that other people can't or don't do. And that was something that we really wanted to put into the character of Senua, because for me, it's a really important aspect of psychosis. I think it becomes a problem. It becomes something for the psychiatrist when it causes more suffering than the person can deal with. And at that point, they seek help, or they may seek help, and you have to do what you can for them and with them.
Right.
But there are a lot of aspects of it that people describe as very rewarding. The world feels rich and vibrant and vivid. They may have insights into how things are connected, what the patterns are that other people don't have, and that feels like a gift.
Right.
And certainly in Senua's case, there were instances, and this again was based on talking to the people who'd experienced psychosis. There were instances of great beauty and pleasure, such as when she's in the meadows and so forth.
Right.
But that can spill over into a darkness that comes very quickly. And also, there's an allusion in the game to the plague that sort of wiped out some of her village. And it was she who first noticed that there was something wrong. And because of that, she was blamed for it.
Wow.
And we wanted to capture this idea that, if somebody doesn't have your reality, then one response to that can be to ostracize them and to persecute them. And I think that's something that people with psychosis do get.
Yeah, that was great. A great answer. And I was thinking, I've explained this game actually to some of my family members, my friends who are not gamers. And, the question I got really was, well, I don't understand, who is this game for, right? Who wants to play as a character with psychosis, right? And I hope that anyone listening to this interview, I imagine by now, that answer has been, that question has been answered. Because, I think what you've demonstrated so far by in this interview is that, yeah, the game is a game. It's fascinating. It's interesting. It's a deep character study, but it's also an enjoyable puzzle game, an action game. So it's for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, this is something Tamim said frequently. He said it's not going to work if it doesn't work as a game. It's not.
Right.
It's not edutainment.
Right.
It's
It
all
could be.
very well
It could
to
be
be
both.
worthy.
It could be both. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Yeah, and seems to me that just because something can be enjoyable and riveting and immersive, that doesn't make it trivial. That that can actually be a way of experiencing something that you wouldn't otherwise engage with.
Yeah. Oh my God. This is a topic I could go on and on for. I'm reading a book now about education and what we can learn about education through games. And that's basically the repeating point over and over, is that education doesn't have to be stale and boring. It doesn't have to be based on written or multiple choice tests. You can learn by immersing yourself, and guarantee you play this game, you're going to come out learning something about psychiatry, about psychology, about the brain.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there's a lot embedded in there from our discussions that are based upon current contemporary cognitive neuroscience ideas. There's even, I don't know if you've come across the hollow mask illusion, which is very beloved of researchers in my field. This is where you see the face, the hollow mask, but you can't see it as hollow because your prior expectation that faces aren't hollow is so strong that your mind just inverts it.
Right.
Well, that appears in the game if you look out for it.
Oh man, I'm gonna have to do another playthrough and watch for it now. Yeah, Paul, you have such interesting. I just want to encourage everyone. Go on YouTube. You're on YouTube already, I guess. But go on YouTube and just Google Paul's name, or YouTube search Paul's name. You have some fascinating TED Talks about perception. There was one really, really cool. This is a tangent, but there's one just really cool thing I saw where you play like an audio cue that's gibberish, and then you're like, well, it's gibberish to you, but it's not gibberish to me because I have a prior experience with this noise. And then you play, a sentence, and then you play it again, and then you hear the sentence. And maybe I didn't explain that well, but go search Paul.
No, you did explain that really well. And I think if there's one phenomenon that really is central to how I think about brain function, it's the idea that if you have a prior expectation, it can be incredibly useful in pulling out the signal from the noise.
Right.
And that's a great gift to have generally, but I think it's somewhere in there. If that balance goes slightly one way or another, then you can deviate from what other people consider to be reality.
Right. So Paul, Hellblade shipped in August of 2017, but your work with Ninja Theory didn't stop there. You founded a research lab, which is called the Insight Project. Could you tell us a little bit about Insight Project?
Yeah, sure. I'd be really pleased to. So, I mean, as I hope I've conveyed the idea that I became a huge fan of the Ninja Theory team as I worked with them. And Tamim and I and Dominic Matthews had a number of conversations in parallel about what video games, how they might be, how they might go beyond representing and maybe used as part of an intervention. And I suppose it was sort of that discussion got lost a bit during the release of Hellblade because there was a lot of other things to think about. But I started avidly looking at the responses to Hellblade online, and became absolutely astonished at just what it had meant to people.
Right.
And I realized that, the opportunity, what all scientists like me want, what all clinicians want, is to have some impact, as you know, for the good. And my usual impact is that I'll publish a paper and maybe 10 people will read it and 3 of them will stop halfway through. And,
that sounds like me making these videos.
I'm sure it's better than that. But suddenly, just because of this work that I'd really enjoyed doing, there was a huge impact on what people were talking about and what they were thinking. And so when Tamim then suggested that we take the ideas we'd been thinking about further and actually formally set them up, I was hugely enthusiastic. And the basic idea was, video games offer us a way of embedding people in a world that they enjoy, that they're immersed in, that they can learn within, in a way that's, I can't think of many other sort of media that could really do that. And could we harness that in the context of scientific experiments on how people perceive things, learn things, how they experience the world? And then could we also use it as a setting in which to train people, or to allow people to train themselves to change their responses? So the central idea of the Insight project is, if we can harness video game expertise and technology, link that up to what we know about the neuroscience of things like anxiety and mood change, is there an opportunity there for actually creating an enjoyable therapeutic setting to, well, train people to feel better, essentially, I suppose.
Wow. And this is something, like you said, that you're working hand in hand with Tamim and the Ninja Theory team, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a real collaboration, actually.
Yeah.
And, part of it is based upon sort of biofeedback, which a number of different video game companies or number of different groups are looking at as well, and doing some great work on. Part of it is based, I think, on the fact that we need to, when we're creating a world for someone in which they're sort of practicing for the real world, if you like, it needs to be a very convincing, very engaging world. And I think what the Ninja Theory team are offering in that respect is quite phenomenal. Every time I visited the studio and put on VR headset, I was blown away by what they were creating.
Wow. That is so exciting. I cannot wait to see and to hear more from you of what comes out of that lab. I do have one more question to ask. Hellblade 2 is in the makes right now. Are you involved with Hellblade 2 at all?
Not as much, no. I can't say much about it. And, as it evolves, maybe there'll be some role for me in discussing. But to be honest, I think the direction it's taking probably isn't, there's probably not that much I can offer.
Right.
Obviously, if they want to talk to me about it, I'll be delighted. There is another game that they're developing, which I think I can talk about a bit because they've released the trailer, but it's called Project Mara, which is an attempt to create a sort of a representation of psychological horror for the player. I mean, I don't think it's going to be a barrel of laughs, to be honest, but it's something that I'm being much more actively involved in with them.
Ooh, okay. I'm going to check out that trailer.
Yeah, I'll check that it's out there. I hope I haven't spoken out of line.
All right, no, we'll be okay. We'll be okay. Paul, thank you so much. This has been just unbelievably fascinating to talk to you, to hear from you. If people want to follow you, if people want to, we already said you can search for Paul on YouTube. He has some really interesting TED Talks. What's the best way for people to kind of track all the awesome work that you're doing?
Well, the Insight Project has a website which people can visit and look at some videos and things. It's insightproject.com. I'm on Twitter, and my email address, I think, is available on most of my talks that are online, but I'd be happy for you to post that address. I'm more than happy to hear from people with comments or thoughts or sometimes even criticisms.
Absolutely. Well, for all of those comments, thoughts, and criticisms, feel free to write in the comments in the description below. I'll go ahead and link Paul's website, or for the Insight Project rather. And for everything positivity and healing and connection and growth in games, keep it here for Digital.Games. Paul, I loved having you on. I'm excited to keep in touch. And everyone, thanks for watching, and game on.